This talk is probably unlike any of the others in this conference. It's actually very simple, and it's very small, it's very detailed. Don't let the simplicity put you off. Actually, I've found this to be transformative, and I'll show you towards the end why. Let me first explain the problem. If you have a website, I presume most of you do run a website of some kind, then up until a few years ago you would be delivering that website onto a desktop, and now things are changing. Now you need to be able to deliver that onto a mobile device. In fact, that's just the tip of the iceberg, and we'll come to the reasons why that's the tip of the iceberg later on. I think that that problem that we're facing now is about to get a great deal larger. The core problem is that when you're having one website and two clients, the question is, how do you find a sense in which the service that's delivered to the two clients represents the same underlying thing? Now, in the very early days, the way people addressed that was like this. They would create a standard type of web stack, but what they would do is they'd create, in effect, two different applications. Each one would produce its own HTML, which would be attached to its own styling, and each of those would be delivered to the client, and it was down to the server to decide which app to serve. And this is a terrible way to do it, because it meant that you were having to write multiple applications, you were having to maintain these applications in synchrony. If you wanted to change any kind of branding, then you had to change both brandings at the same time, and you had 4 times the problem. So this was a lousy way to do multi-client websites. So what happened was that people started saying, well, why can't we use the CSS to do the styling for the website? So we created stacks rather like this, where you would have one application, you'd have one set of HTML, you'd have one bit of CSS which would try and tune itself to whichever client it was talking to. And there's a whole bunch of facilities in the CSS to help us do that. Trouble is, and that's pretty much the way people try and do it now. That's a lousy way to do it as well. And the reason why that's a lousy way to do it is that it means that what you have to do is you've got to create a single lump of HTML which is appropriate for both of these things. You have to make a whole bunch of design compromises to squeeze into this framework what it is you actually want to deliver. Now, a few years ago, CSS was at its most extreme, and people were trying to control this pixel level. They would say you create divs for everything, and you just place the divs on the page wherever you wanted them. And they were having to do this at pixel level because the principle behind this was that you were losing the relationships between them. The old HTML, when people were laying out in tables, at least the table said something about the relative disposition on the page. When you switch to divs, the whole point was that you were taking that away and putting it in the CSS. But the CSS was having to inject that in all sorts of artificial ways. And so it meant that when we started moving onto a whole constellation of mobile devices, they were all different. That kind of very fine control stopped meaning anything at all. So people started moving into fluid layouts, and again, even those didn't really solve the problem, because the experience of using a service on a mobile device is quite different from using a service on a desktop. Now let me show you what I think has happened. I'm going to sort of try and draw a map of this. This is the old style. What we were doing 10 years ago was we were using the HTML to represent both the content and the layout, and everybody thought this was a bad thing. We'd use the CSS to provide the chrome and the branding around the outside of that, and then all the activity came from the JavaScript at the back of it. This is something that you recognize. This is probably not something that you would defend today. What we've done is we've moved on from that, and we've said, well, the HTML should contain the content, and HTML5 is much more semantic than the old HTML4 and 3. But we've put a huge amount of load on the CSS. The CSS is now controlling the layout and the styling and a whole bunch of interactivity, and the JavaScript is basically relegated to talking back to the server. And if you're going to put that much work into a language, it had better be a bloody good language. And CSS isn't. It just isn't hairy-chested enough to solve this problem. But actually, this is just the tip of the iceberg, as I said. What we're heading towards now is one website with loads of clients. We know, for example, that we've got desktop and mobile, but mobile is now split. We now have very small devices. We've got much bigger tablet devices, which sort of fall somewhere between a mobile device and a desktop device. The thing about tablets is that they're big and you can work with them, but they're still inherently mobile. So all of the advantages that you get from mobilizing it, from walking around with it in the streets, you still have, which you don't have with a desktop. And yet it feels a bit more like a desktop experience. So there's this halfway stage between a mobile and a desktop, which is represented by the tablets. And then you can go down even further. 10 years ago, we had WAP phones. Now, WAP is crap, everybody knows that, WAP's tied to death. But the kind of design requirements that WAP required are now moving on to wearables. And when you've got a screen that big, then it fundamentally transforms the way you're going to interact with it. I think the next big thing is going to be voice. At the moment, you can talk to your devices, and it's fairly crude. You have to talk through Siri, or you have to talk through the Google voice thing. And you can't do very much with it apart from talk to Google or talk to Siri. But my feeling is that there's an awful lot of people for whom voice input and voice output is going to be very important. Not just people who are blind. Have you any idea how hard it is to use a smartphone when you're blind? But when you're driving, I mean, a major proposition of a mobile device is that you are mobile, but you can't look at screens and you can't sort of fiddle around with control surfaces when you're driving. So you need voice in and voice out. And what we want to do is we want to mobilize our website, we want to take the same website experience, the same application experience, and deliver that through a voice interface. This is going to be, I think, the next 5 years. Might be wrong, but so shoot me. And then there's other kinds of interface beyond that. I mean, right now, we have this distinction between clients which are running on a mobile device talking to a service which is online. So it sort of moves the intelligence towards the device, but that's a balance. There's, this is not an either-or. There's all sorts of variations within that, which really we need to be thinking about. So, for example, a website is useless if you're offline. A client is great if you're offline because you can build the intelligence in. But how much do you have to cache? And that's a kind of negotiation. It really should be part of delivering the experience. So when we look at the distinction between a desktop and a mobile experience, actually there's a whole bunch of stuff going in there. And in the future, we are going to have to really address these problems. So what we've got now, this idea of compromising on the CSS and compromising on the layout at the early stages, I actually don't think is going to carry very much further forward. We need a different kind of solution. You comfortable with that idea? Anybody disagree with me? Well, that's really good. Okay. So, what's the answer? Well, this is what we did 10 years ago. This is what we're doing now. This is what I'm doing. I think that we're misusing HTML. I think that HTML, I mean, it does have its semantic content now, but I think that HTML is really good at talking about layout and relationships, much better than CSS is, and we don't really have anything else. But we actually do have a better solution for talking about content. So I think this moving HTML out in this direction, I think that's the wrong thing to do. I think it should have gone the other way. So this is what I think our stack should look like. I think we should be delivering content through XML. I think we should be turning the XML into the HTML to deliver basic ground maps, ground plans. Then we should be using the CSS for styling. And yes, for the interactivity, because it's much better now to put the interactivity onto the client, and then still use the JavaScript to talk to the server. That's what I think our stack should be. The advantage of that is that one piece of XML can produce different pieces of HTML and different CSSs, still using the same JavaScript. So at this point, what comes out of your application is the same. And what goes back into your application is the same. But the way it's formatted and delivered to the device and to the user, that's what's replaceable. Now, in terms of the technology that we've got, I can't think of any other way of delivering that variation of experience other than like this. There's nothing else that can fit into this space other than the HTML and the CSS. So, by all means, use the semantic features of the HTML. But if you use the HTML to create your basic layout and your formatting, then I think that you're going to get a stronger result. Now, I'd like to show you an example of this. In fact, I'd like to show you a good example of this, but unfortunately, confidentiality intervenes. So I'm going to show you a shitty example of this, which is a site that I've been working on entirely pro bono, and what I'm showing you is some private work on it, which has not been approved or anything like that, but it does show you the principle of what I'm talking about. Okay, now, what we've got here is a perfectly simple, straightforward website. It's not great design, but it doesn't have to be. It's laid out exactly the way you'd expect a website to be laid out. It's got a bit of intelligence going on behind the scenes. So these pictures on the side, which should, oh, I know why I haven't worked. Can you see my mouse? There it is. Yes, those pictures cycle around. It's an interactive menu. That's all being done by the CSS, of course. So it's not clever, it's not tricky, but it's a really basic website. Now, this is laid out using divs. This is laid out the normal way of doing it. So, you know, this is not tables. This is the way we would do it today. What we've done, though, why is this taking so long? There we go. I'm sorry, I'm going to turn this around. This is really hard to see from this side. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell it that I'm coming from a mobile device. And this same thing is going to rearrange into this. So again, you can see it's the same experience. You can see it's the same website. You can see that this is rearranged to be suitable for a mobile. But in order to do this, those layouts, that positioning, it would be very difficult, it would be possible, but it would be very difficult to come up with a piece of meaningful CSS that would turn what you saw first into this. In order to produce this, it's actually produced, it's the very simple CSS behind both of them, but what it's done is it's produced a new piece of HTML. And the new piece of HTML to produce this is designed around this mobile layout. And in fact, this has got its own responsiveness built in. So again, if you look at that top line, then there will be a point at which it will take the menu back down onto the left. And this is the CSS that's doing this. But taking these pictures and moving up to the top, that's the HTML. The fact that we're, the fact that it's now going down in a straight column, and we'll see that there are features which would appear underneath the menu. I can play with this later on, but things that would have appeared under the menu are now appearing down at the bottom of the screen. And again, this is much, much easier to do in the HTML than it is to do in adaptive CSS. Now, what lies behind this is something very simple. It is just a chunk of XML, which is pure content. We care about content. We've been talking about making the HTML context-rich for a long time. This is the purest form of the content that it can be. So that the pictures that you saw, they're just listed as a bunch of tasters, and they're pictures with links attached to them. And this is telling us where to find the pictures. But how we display them, how we put them on the screen, I mean, all the other interactivity, like doing the zoom-ins, this is not part of that. This is just saying it's a taster. So far, so good? Okay. Now, let me show you that as a stack. This is really hard to do working on two screens. Does that work? Here we go. So, here's the stack that's delivering that. We've got one application, as you saw before, what we have is two skins. One skin for the desktop site, one skin for the mobile site. And each of those is delivering its own HTML and pulling in its own CSS. And the choice here is being made at the server based on the user agent string. In fact, based on a bunch of things, but the simple case is the user agent string. Now let me tell you what this isn't. This is not client-side XSL. Okay, we are doing this at the server because what we're trying to do is deliver the simplest possible thing to the client. If you've got somebody walking around with a phone and they've got really patchy internet, you don't want to dump loads of things at them which they can't see. They might not even have broadband. I mean, they might have a very narrow channel. Some of these people, I mean, I was in a job where people were wandering around in Africa with phones, and they had really, really patchy internet. And so we had to make sure that we had very, the shortest possible delivery to the client that we possibly could. So we are doing this at the server. But this is not master pages or anything like it, because the trouble with master pages is that they're integrated right into the app itself. Basically, that's a structure inside the app. It's not an external structure. What we want the app to do is to produce the XML, because the app itself is what cares about the content. It's something else which cares about everything else. So this is being done at the server, but outside of any application. This is being done by the server itself. Does that make sense? So what I want to explain to you is how that actually does it. So here's our agenda. We're going to talk about how to set up a server. I've done this on a number of different servers, but I'm going to show you Apache because everybody knows Apache, even if they don't use it. I'm going to show you how to make the skins. I'm going to show you how to generate the application output, because there's a few gotchas in there, and it took a while to figure out the best way to do that. And then I'm going to explain a few lessons that I learned out of this. And here is the place where I'm going to tell you why it is that I would not consider building a website with any other architecture now, even if I didn't care about multi-clients. Because I found that this is a really useful tool. Any questions at that point? Okay, good. Now, Apache has a computational model which is fearsomely complicated. I have read the documentation. They seem to have about 3 different versions of their pipeline. I have written output filters, and I still don't understand their model. So this is a very simplified explanation of what's going on in Apache. Basically, what happens is a request comes in, and it goes through a series of filters which transform the request step by step. Then it hits the script engine, or the CGI engine, or whatever it is, that delivers the service. So that's what turns the request into the response. And then the response goes through a number of output filters, which are plugged in circuit. Now, there are several different ways of defining these things and putting them into circuit and taking them out. There's a big change between 2.2 and 2.4, but the basic principles remain the same. First thing you've got to do is get the module into Apache space. So somewhere in the configuration file, you've got to say, this is where it is. Now what I'm using here, and what I'm using on the website that you just saw, is a heavily pimped version of modxsl2, which is an open source thing which you can pick up anywhere. It's written in C, so it's dead easy to modify. But basically what you've got to do is load it into the address space. So that's how that does that. It loads the module. Then you've got to make it do something. So this is where we take that module and we place it into the output filters. So we're saying that every time we produce something from here, whose type is XML, then we're going to pass it through this filter. So this is how you build up the filter chain. Then what we've got to do is to say when we're going to use it. Now these are instructions to the module itself. So this is saying, if you see this header right here, then what we're going to do is mix in this file. So have any of you had any experience with XSL? This is possibly worth stopping with. Anybody not seen this? Do you not know what I'm talking about? Okay, that's good. All right. So basically what we're going to do, we've got the source file, we've got the XSL file, and we're merging them together to produce the results. And so this is the point at which we add it in. If we've got the mobile header, or whatever the signal is that it's a mobile, then we'll use this one, and Failing that, this is a chain of exclusive, so it'll always pick the first one. Failing that, it'll pick a default transformation. So again, that's fairly straightforward. There's one gotcha in this, which took me a while to figure out, and that is error pages. Most error pages in Apache, they're produced as a result of something going wrong. Usually they're produced as a result of the script itself. So if you're going to deauthorize somebody, then it's the page itself, it's the script itself which produces the deauthorization signature, and so that will go through this. But if you hit a 404, then it doesn't. The 404 bypasses all of this stuff. And so either you've got to deliver it in its final form, you've got to create the 404 page in its final form, or else you've got to find some way of getting it through this filter. And so the way you get it through this filter is a bit of a hack. And what we're going to do is we're going to say, if the file name doesn't exist, then we're going to use a file which does exist and pass that through. So it's just a bit of a hack, it's a bit of ugliness. I don't know why it's that way in Apache. I couldn't be bothered to hack Apache, but that's the way to fix that. And that's it. That's pretty much all the server setup you need. Once you've got that in place, then you've got the transformers working for you. Any questions at that point, by the way?
Would this stop like a customer from, typically on a site now, if you're viewing on a mobile, you can go to a desktop view. You wouldn't be able to do that because you're rendering the HTML from the user agent string.
Let me play back the question to make sure I'm understanding it correctly. You're saying that if somebody is coming at it from a mobile device, yeah, and he wants to switch to the desktop view, then the fact that we're switching based on the user agent means that we can't do that.
Yeah.
Is that your question?
Yeah.
Yes, but this is just an illustration of how you would switch. If you want to switch to a determinedly desktop site, I mean, one of the things that people have been doing, particularly when they're using multiple stacks, is you have a separate mobile subdomain, which will serve up mobile no matter what. You can have a desktop subdomain, which will serve up desktop no matter what. And at that point, you don't need the switching. You can switch based on the subdomain rather than on the user agent. So if you're absolutely determined that you want to serve up the mobile, the desktop, then you would give them a subdomain to do it. Or you'd set a flag. You'd put something in the cookie and switch on the cookie. There's any number of ways. The point about it is that this here will take anything which is available in the request and test against it. And we can have as many of these tests as you want. So the way you're testing, or what you'd like to test against, is, it's down to you. I mean, I could keep going, but it won't fit on the screen. So, are you happy with that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Next step. Now, let's explain what the task is that we're trying to do, just to make sure that we're in the same place. What we've got is we have a piece of pure content like that. And what we want to do is turn it into a lump of HTML like that. Make sense? And what you saw on the other side was simply this process. Now, in order to do that, we need a transformer. We need a set of rules which will transform the one into the other. Anybody had any experience using XSL? Okay. I'm taking the rest of you don't. Okay. This is what they say about XSL. It's ugly. They are right. They say that it's extremely verbose. They are right. After a while, you learn to see through the noise and just stop seeing it and go just straight for what you want. They also say that it's utterly unforgiving. The specification for XML says that if the XML is not well formed, then you have to reject it completely. So if there's any faults in your application data, and if there's any faults in your transformation file, then you just see a blank screen. That's true too. So everything that you've heard about XML, even the bad bits, is true, but it's all right, you can work around that. This is an example of just how verbose and pointlessly verbose it is. This is pretty much what you need just to frame a transformation. We're starting off by saying that it's XML, that there's an encoding, and then we're giving a whole bunch of things which say what what language elements, what DTTs we want to pull in. And then we say what sort of output that we want. And that's actually a fairly important line, because we need to not just format. One of the things that XSL will do is, just because the output format is not XML doesn't mean it can't produce it. If you want to produce HTML4, which is very far from well-formed XML, then you can still produce it. It's just that the transformer has to know that that's what it's working with. If you want to produce plain text or PostScript or PDFs, then again, it'll do it for you. It just has to know that that's what it's doing. So these lines are pretty important, because what they do is they pretty much define what the task is that it's going to try and take on. Comfortable with that? You can basically just copy and paste this into every script. It's a gift from the gods, just use it. Okay, now once you've got that, this is one of the most important things. I didn't do this at the beginning, and I was just continually lost. This is a null transformation. The way XSL works is you have a series of rules, and you say, if what we're looking at now matches this rule, then we do this. And what this rule says is, no matter what you're looking at, this will match anything, and what it does is it copies it. So this says, if you pass a piece of XML through this, then what you get out is exactly what you put in. This is great for debugging, because otherwise, if you don't have this, then things just go missing and you don't know where they've gone. But putting this in means that you can just ignore everything that you're not handling directly. You can just use it. It also means that you can mix XML or fragments of XML into your original XML files, and it will just copy it through to the output and not try and question it. So you saw in the example there was like those little fragments of XML of HTML embedded. It's this that transmits it to the output, and you don't have to write the rules for it. So that's also the place where you start. You just copy it in, it just works. Now after that, what you do is you start putting in rules which match the input. And again, the way XSL works is it scans through, it reads the original tree, the original XML, and it scans through node by node. And at each node it says, if this node is of some type, then we will do such and such a rule. So this is an example where it's looking for the one page element, which is on the page. And it says that if we see a page, then we need to generate an HTML page. And what we're going to do is we're going to find the title of that page, which is an attribute, and stick it inside a heading. And then the content of the page, which itself has contents. Once we can find the content, each child node will then be copied, in this case using this rule. Now the reason for showing you this and for explaining it in the detail that I have is to say, actually, everything you've heard about XML is true, and yet it's still perfectly simple. I mean, although there's a lot of text here, the basic principle of what it's doing is utterly straightforward. And because, building it up step by step the way I showed you, it's actually a very clear, very simple, very progressive process. You get to test frequently, you get to check it frequently. One of the nice things about XML is that if it works, if it ever works, it always works. So testing itself is just really simple. If you get the output, then it's what you wanted. Okay. Now, there's something else that I want to explain about this now. I've shown you the XML, I've shown you the transformation, I've shown you how it works. But I want to make the point again that this is all happening at the server as part of an output filter. And that means that there are certain things you can do. If you do this at the client, then all you can do at the client is rearrange, make these transformations and rearrange it from one form to another. And you can't add anything to it. But since we're doing this at the server, then we still have an awful lot of information available to the transformer. And this is one of the things that the module that I've chosen, this is where it really helps. Because it introduces a protocol called local. And what local means is that the transformer, the XSL, is allowed to refer to other files, to other URLs. So it can pull in other documents, it can pull in other transformers and that sort of thing. But as it does so, it doesn't lose the original request string. So you saw where the menu was responsive. Now, as you click around from page to page, that menu changes. So it shows you, it's sort of like a mini breadcrumb, where you are in the navigation tree. Now, there is no menu in the content. As far as this is concerned, that's Chrome. That's something which is put in by the transformer. So how does the menu know where it is on the page? Well, that's because in this local transaction, we're able to tell the menu where on the page we are. And so the transformer can bear that, take that into account and put an active classes onto the menu items corresponding to the pages that we're on. And it knows all that just from the menu tree, which is specified, again, as a lump of XML. So it can bring in lumps of XML which are on the server. It can do transformations based on them. And it can do all of this in the server before it sends it off to the client. Now, this is something which is impossible to do with client-side XML because all that information is lost. And it's actually really hard to do with master pages, because even master pages don't pass this kind of information between the separate fragments. So the fact that we're doing it at server side and the fact that we're doing it as part of this output chain actually gives us a hell of a lot of power that we can't get any other way. So menus, we've just seen the menus. You can have login systems. You can have like little login panes. And the transformer itself, or these fragments, can keep track of who the authenticated user is, how they've logged in, logging them in and out, all of that sort of thing. It can be done completely in a separate lump and not part of the content at all. Again, various kinds of personalization. If I want a particular skin, if I want big letters, or if I want a particular colorway. Again, this can all be done by the transformer itself at the server in ways that would be impossible to do if it was client-side. So this model, I want to impress on you that what this model here, it gives you a change in capability, which as far as I'm aware is not available practically any other way. Any questions at that point? You look like you're back. Sorry. Go ahead.
Is it possible to get one of the benefits of master pages is to get consistent feelings
Yeah.
to the website? Can you get that from this, or are you writing one XSL different page layout which contains everything?
No. Do you remember the architecture that I showed you before? There is one XML representing the output from the application with the XML comes into the system. We then transform that XML into HTML using the transformer. But that doesn't care what the app is. It doesn't care what the page is. All it's doing is taking that and transforming it. So for a single website, for a single delivery, for a single set of switches, we only have one transformer. So the artist's pages, every page in that website is going through one XML file, or one XSL file, which is either the mobile file or the default file. Unless we choose to mix other things in. So we could, for example, say, do a test if he's not authorized, and then add in another transformer. You can put in as many transformers as you want, because you can see that the rules, the matches, are all independent of each other. So we could say, all right, if he's unauthorized, and if this is his third login, then let's put some red flashing lights on the page and stuff like that, and that's just a mix-in. So in that sense, then you can have per page or per condition transformations, but you don't have to. The principle is that you have a set of rules for deciding which transformations to use, which is completely independent of the rules which decide which script you're using. Is that answering the question you're asking?
Yeah.
Would you like to see the website and see moving around in it? Would that help?
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Okay. That is the page that you saw before. That's just some verbiage. And again, you can see stuff in the sidebar. again, similar sort of thing, similar sort of layout. We've got a bunch of content and stuff in the sidebar. So you can see this has all got a sort of a coherent design to it. And that coherent design is defined by the XSL. If we switch into that's amusing. I'm glad you didn't see that. Yes, now if we switch over to the mobile version, is that loading? Yeah, if we switch over to the mobile version, then you can see it's the same content, and you can see that we're working with the same content in the same way. But you can see the changed layouts. I mean, we don't have the taters along the top anymore, but what was in the sidebar has now dropped to the bottom. Again, if we go back to that page, again, you can see that it's the same content, and you can see that it shares some similarities with the other mobile pages.
So each of those pages work on the same XSL?
Yes. As long as we're inside the mobile site, it's the same XSL. When we're in the desktop site, it's the same XSL. These are more interesting pages because these are much more complex layouts. Again, we have this taters concept at the top, but we have a lot more layout and a lot more structure on the page. If I show you the desktop version of that, you can see it's a very different kind of arrangement. But this is still the same XSL that was producing the home page and the About Us page and the directory page. It's still the same XSL as long as we're on the desktop site. Now, when we switch to the mobile site, and allow this to kick in, that's not being done by the XSL, that's being done by the CSS. So the fact that it's taken the menu away, and the fact that it's put like the little menu at the top, that's the CSS that's doing that. The server doesn't know what the client area is. I don't even think that's ever put in the request string. So the server can't know that. So that change has to be done by the CSS. You more comfortable?
Yeah. How does that scale across how many pages on this site?
Not very many.
How does that scale across the site with different pages or something? Do you end up with one monstrous XSL sheet?
No, you don't.
Or do you run to? You have to be careful with how you structure your XML.
You have to understand, when you're producing your XML, what the semantic function of each element is. And then what you have to do in the XSL is work out how you're going to dispose that semantics onto the page. So for example, in these pages, we know that we're going to be giving some biography about the artist. We know we're going to give directions, we're going to give a map, we're going to give an address. There's also email forms which are hidden but will pop up. There's a whole bunch of things that are going on. Now in the XML, we're going to say, oh, right, this is biography. This is a bunch of contact details. Here is the address, here's the map, that sort of thing. So in that sense, we can be very specific about the semantics of it. What I have found is that there aren't that many different semantic elements in a website, because once you've understood your problem space, once you've understood what the website's about, then actually it turns out to be quite limited. This website apparently contains, maybe a couple of hundred pages because of all of the subscribers and because of all the members who are listed on it. But actually, there's damn few scripts, because most of the things, they all go through the same script. You can see that this page is auto-generated. She hasn't made this page for herself. Yeah, that is her. And what you find is that websites tend to have a fairly simple narrative behind them. So you take something enormous like eBay. Let's look at the semantic elements that they would have to express in the XML using a strategy like this. Well, obviously they need welcome pages and hellos, and they need a bit of stuff to, taster pages to try to draw you in. But then you'll have a few account pages. You'll have a few pages which are absolutely behind the login. So it will show you your account, it will show you stuff like that. And what the actual content is, the XSL doesn't need to care about. It just needs to care, this is account data, this is privileged, and this is how it disposes, and this is, this is like a map of the account system. It's got offer pages. It will show you lists of products, and then it will show you detailed pages about products. Very similar layout to the way this is laid out. So they've only got basically two concepts in there, and within that, it's relatively straightforward. So once you're getting past a couple of dozen basic concepts which have to go into these rules, then actually what's happening is that your website itself is becoming confusing. So I would say generally you don't get these behemoths that spread out and spread out. They tend to be fairly compact. And if you find that your website actually is 3 or 4 websites all bundled into one, which does happen, well, you can always mix them in. You can always have, well, this is our main Chrome, and then this is our semantic Chrome, and then here's our main Chrome, and here's our semantic content. You can mix and match these transformation rules pretty much however you want, because they're designed to interoperate. And the modifications that I've done allow you to say, well, I'm going to have 3 or 4 different XSLs at once, and I will select them, and then create those and pipeline them up. So I do this, then I do this, then I do this. So I will first of all expand the menus, for example, and then I will expand the authentications, and then I will finally wrap the Chrome on it. So, and that kind of decomposition also helps you. But the answer is no, it doesn't seem to get out of hand. It seems to be fairly modest.
In your eBay example, obviously a product detail page is completely different from the shopping basket.
Yes.
You would still run that off the same stuff?
Yeah. Yeah, I would, because the difference is, I'll tell you why I'd run it off the same XSL. Product detail pages are going to list a bunch of products, and it's going to show you them, it's going to show you a picture, it's going to show you some commentary, that kind of thing. When you get to your order pages, it's going to show you pretty much the same thing. It's going to say, I am showing you this product. This is the product in your basket, and there's a list of them. So that concept of a list of products is common between your basket and the catalog pages. Now, you might choose to display them the same, or you might choose to display them different. But that is absolutely a skinning choice. It's not an application choice. Is that answering the question you're asking?
Yeah, but the functionality you've then got on the pages are different as well. Because obviously you've got a product detail that's add to my cart.
Yep.
The basket is credit card details.
Yeah. And it might be, show me what we've got and delete it from the cart. There might be a lot of commonality there. But even so, that interactivity and the affordances which are provided by the website when it shows you that product page, again, I would say this is a function of the skinning. Because, I mean, either it's legal to modify your order or it's not. Well, if it is, well, provide that functionality, and if it's not, then don't provide the functionality. And maybe it's, well, welcome back, Jules. Please log in to modify your order. So depending upon the login status or the authentication status, you would change that affordance. Now again, this is not an application level thing. This is still a skinning level thing. And in fact, I'm going to show towards the end why I think that this skinning is important at an authentication and security level. And it gets you away from doing that authentication at the application, which is actually a very good thing. I'll explain that later on. Are you happy for me to carry on now? Okay. There it is. Yes. That's it. Okay, so I'd explain to you why it was important that this was operating at the server. Any more questions at that point? Okay. Now, what do you do at the scripting level? Again, I'm going to assume that you know PHP, even if you only use it under an assumed name. But that's because PHP, for this kind of stack, is the most popular language. Now, when you're writing PHP normally, PHP is dead simple. What you do is you've got a bunch of script code which alternates between the script itself and producing output. And there's absolutely no restrictions on the output that you can produce. You can use PHP to produce HTML, or you can use it to produce plain text, or you can use it to produce anything else that you want. And it's up to the client to decide how to decode whatever it is you produce. Now in XML, you can't get away with that. In XML, it absolutely has to be well formed. You absolutely have to close every tag that you open, and you absolutely have to do it in sync. You absolutely have to use the correct character sets and character encodings, because if you don't, it will simply reject. Now that means that it is just too dangerous to use standard PHP scripting. The reason, I mean, look at the things that can go wrong. Supposing the program crashes and it just stops halfway. Then you've got a whole bunch of open tags and then it stops, it will reject. Let's suppose halfway through the code it produces a warning. The warning's just dumped in the middle of the XML, it will reject. So we need to cope with all of this. This is now what we're trying to do. We absolutely have to trap this, and we have to produce well-formed XML even when things are going wrong inside the script. Now, one of the things that this will do is if you can get over this problem, then the XML will give you some protection against these sorts of errors. It will stop these things from finding their way onto the client surface. But in the meantime, we've got to make sure that something gets onto the client surface at all. So, this is back to the configuration that you saw before. This is part of the Apache configuration. What we're going to do is we're going to add a bunch of stuff, specifically talking about the files. Now, first thing we're going to do is we're going to say that the standard output from PHP, rather than being HTML, which is what it would normally be, we're telling it it is always XML. Now you can put that in the scripts, but it's actually better to put it in here because you actually don't want to clutter up the scripts with this stuff. This is a server level thing, this is a configuration level thing anyway, so that's the correct place to put it. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to say that HTML files, normally it would be .php files that would go through the PHP interpreter, actually it's the HTML files that go through the PHP interpreter. Now this is a bit back to front, but the reasoning behind this is that what is being served up to the client is an HTML file. It says, I want something.html, or I want something.htm. What you should serve it up is HTML. Even though the script is producing XML, we know, because of this stuff, that it's going to get transformed into HTML before it gets sent to the client. So actually, what we want to do is put HTML requests through the PHP script, even though it's producing XML. Does that make sense? Okay. Now the final thing that we do is, I don't know if you've ever seen this before, what you can do is you can say at the beginning of every script, before you even start on the script itself, you can interpose another script. And what we're doing here is we're interposing these support files here, this support file, which is creating this sense of opening and closing tags. This is all of the protection that we need is in here. From this point on, echoes and prints are forbidden, because echoes and prints, you can't guarantee the XML correctness. What we use instead is a tag. Now what a tag does is it says we're going to open an HTML tag, and that's going to be the name of it. And we're going to give it a set of attributes. Here are the attributes. And then we're going to put something inside it, and when we've finished, we're going to close the tag. So what this does is it opens the tag, does whatever's necessary inside, and closes it. And this is a guarantee, right? No matter what happens in there, we can have nuclear war declared in there, it will still close the tag, right? And I'll show you in a moment how it does that. Now, in order to keep the generality, what's in there is a function. So we can put anything in there that we want, so long as The only thing that we do is open and close tags. Well, the only way we produce output is to open and close tags. So this, again, is that very simple file that you saw before. We're opening the page and giving it a title of Hello World. And then inside that, we're defining an attribution tag. There aren't any attributes. But what we are going to do is we're going to list the attributes here as tags. Make sense? I mean, this is really simple code, right? It looks like the XML it's generating. It doesn't look like a set of calls. I actually found that when I started coding like this, it was and I wanted to produce HTML output. This is a better way to produce HTML output. Not even because it's protected, but because it looks like the HTML. You don't get all confused and mixed up inside itself. It's no problem calling functions, of course. So other than this layout, it's absolutely conventional PHP. At this point, I've broken out and I'm producing literal output. So this is no longer tagging, this is just producing output. You have to be dead careful in this to produce well-formed XML, because if this is malformed, it's going to fail. So the rule here is that you can put in anything you want as a literal string to be copied to the output, so long as there is no interpolation, so long as that doesn't have code inside it. If you do that, and if you want to put code inside it, it's got to be tags. If you do it that way, then it might fail. But it will fail right away. So you run it once, a little error. And if it doesn't error, then so long as what's around it is correct, and that's correct, then that is never going to be not correct, no matter what else changes in the file. So as I say, if you want to break out of that, if you want to produce something very straightforward and simple, you can, but just make sure you keep it straightforward and simple and leave your protection in place. So far, so good? Now, what this tag does is it keeps an eye on a whole bunch of things. If there is an exception thrown in here, then it catches the exception and uses that to close the tag. If there is an error, then it catches the error and it prints out an error tag. And depending on the nature of the error, if it's a fatal error, it will throw an exception and unwind. And if it's not a fatal, then it will come back to where it started from. But what it's done is it's interposed this error message. If you want to produce a stack trace, then it will produce a stack trace entirely in XML form. So all of those like red things that you normally get that sort of splurge all over your content, that won't be there. It'll be XML. And it will be part of your output stream. So you get your debugging output exactly as you normally would. And of course, this is all completely automatic because we've put the, we've required in the configuration file that the stuff that provides this is part of every single script call. So it's entirely automatic. You don't need to do anything to put it in. But what you get is you get, in effect, PHP in HTML rather than PHP in brain dump. Does that make sense? So what I'll do is I will show you what that code looks like. Okay, so here is the tag function. Sorry, I'm going to have to sit down for this. There it is. Here's the error handler, and you can see it just catching all of the errors. And then this is the emergency shutdowns. Does that move? Yep, that's it, automatic. So it's not complicated, it's not big, but it does provide the protection that you need. So far, so good? I'm not going to test you on this, it's just to give you an idea of the layout. You're comfortable with this as an idea? Okay. So you've seen how to construct this whole stack. You've seen how to, you've seen how to install it. You've seen how to construct the scripts. So the skins. You've seen how to construct the scripts. Okay. And none of this is complicated. As I said at the beginning, this is actually pretty simple. So long as you're aware of the gotchas, then it's all pretty straightforward. So what's the advantage of this? Well, the obvious advantage is we can deliver the same content in different forms. At the moment, I've been comparing a mobile site with a desktop site. But you can see that if I wanted to deliver this onto a wearable device, you can see it's trivial. You can see that if I wanted to start adding functionality to it, to one or the other, it would be trivial. One of the things about this is an exhibition. This website is about an exhibition. So if you wanted to be able to construct a facility to say, I want to go to these venues and then use the mobile device to guide you, it would be trivial to add that to the website such that it was more effective on the mobile side than the desktop side, because obviously you take your mobile with you on the road. That kind of distinction, that kind of changing affordances, that too would be trivial. And in fact, you can change the affordances even while retaining the integrity of the website as a whole. And you can see that, right? If we did want to switch over into voice input and output, particularly voice output, you can see that this is trivial. If you wanted to produce something for people who were sight impaired, you can see that would be trivial. Okay? It's much easier to do it from this pure semantic XML form than it is working from the HTML and trying to automatically reverse engineer it. But there is more. This is inherently cross-platform. One of the things that we used this for was we were trying to provide a coherent service between, on a website, onto a whole bunch of devices, including bang up-to-date browsers on fast, well-connected laptops and IE6 on ancient Russian laptops in the middle of Africa. And what we wanted to do was not just provide a similar experience, but also to provide a gracefully degrading experience. Now we found that with this, we could measure data about the connection speed, and we could use that to feed it into the transformation process and into the switching process. To the point where we were able to, in a back channel, download a client onto the onto the device, and then switch over to that client once it was there in order to reduce the bandwidth when we needed to do that. So we had a lot of flexibility there. So you can see that you can have a great degree of fine control on this. You can control individual clients, you can control individual needs on individual clients, you can have all sorts of mode switching going on entirely behind the scenes. This turns out to be a really powerful thing, if that's the kind of facilities that you need. The next thing that we found was security. And this was pretty obvious once we'd seen it, but it wasn't something that we were anticipating experiencing when we first started. It works like this. You have your application producing information, right? And then you've got this transformer, which will preserve that information, or which will transform that information into the final form, into the HTML, whatever it is you're using. But it's cherry picking. It says, each script says, I care about this, and I care about this, and I care about this. So it means that if there's debugging information, or if there's error information embedded in the XML, it doesn't get transmitted to the client. It actually gets actively filtered out. So you can put as much auditing and as much debugging information into your script, and you can read the script directly. You can create filters which don't invoke the XML at all, which don't invoke the XSL at all. It just delivers the XML. So you can read all of this stuff in plain text. But the moment you put the XSL in circuit, then all of that stuff disappears, and what you're left with is the pure content being sent to the customer. So this makes the debugging really easy, but it makes the security great, because it means that if people are trying to attack your, if people are trying to attack your website, well, they might get the kind of information that you would get back through Bobby tables disappears. It's not there anymore because it's been filtered out by the XML, by the XSL. So we have a whole level of security there. We've also found that we can run these on different machines. What a common way of building a stack, and we've done it as well, is you create an application server, and then above that, on a different machine, even possibly on a different segment, you will create the client server and the static server. Now what we can do is we can put this in that static server, which means that there's actually an air gap between the XSL and the underlying stuff, the underlying application, which makes it really difficult to attack through that because it's all being filtered through the XSL as it comes back out again. So, in security terms, it's really strong. One of the modifications that we made to this module was we cached. We could see when things were getting out of date. So it meant that we could have caching servers sitting up here, and we could really speed up the process because the pages that didn't change, we could transform them as if they did change. We could transform them just not caring whether they're up to date or not, but it would serve out of cache if the underlying pages hadn't changed. And we could give them like 5 seconds of lifetime or 10 seconds of lifetime or a day of lifetime, depending on what we knew about it. And we could embed that information right there into the XML itself. So again, very, very fine control of lifetime and caching. I mentioned before about graceful degradation. One of the good things about this is that if you're talking to some crappy old browser, then you can deliver crappy old HTML. If you're delivering to something extremely quirky like IE6, then you can deliver quirky code. And all you need to do is to bear in mind, okay, I know that's what I'm talking to, put the switch in, and deliver up that, that browser-specific code. And remember, one of the things that you can do is you can have lots of different XSL files all contributing to one transformation. And they stack in a similar way to the CSS stacks. There's a priority order, what does what when. So it means that what you can do is you can create a generalized file, and then you can create an IE6 specific tuning file, which is relatively small and modest. And you just put it in circuit, and it's then working for you. Development. When you're producing something like master pages, the idea behind master pages is that you can have one team working on the pages and another team working on the content, but it doesn't quite work that way. In this, absolutely it does. There is an air gap. You can have people working on the app and producing XSL and absolutely not caring what it looks like client-side. And they can put anything in it that they want. So long as it's got the basic semantic content that you need to deliver the message to the customer, then you can put in anything in addition that you want. All you have to do is agree on the DTD. It means that you can have people working on the app, and you can have people working on the front end, on the styling, and then specialists working on particular mobile sites. And it also means that if you want to experiment with different chromes or different layouts, it's really easy. You can have a bunch of people saying, well, let's try a vertical form, let's try a narrative form, let's try a scrolling form. And you can just make it and drop it in and look at it side by side very, very quickly, very easily. The kind of things which in master pages would be impossible because the master pages are all bound into the same code base. And you'd have to muck about with branches and all sorts of things. It's just a separate file in this, and it becomes very, very simple. So what we found was that developers were just not tripping over each other anymore. People could express their specialism and express their expertise and do it virtually independently and still have this collaborative development going on. And that too was a complete surprise at how effective that was. I mentioned the embedded diagnostics. I mentioned briefly about these experimental things. Making up wireframes is easy, making up mock-ups is easy. The sense in which you can migrate a website and you can make small changes or make big changes and compare them, it is absolutely liberating. It's so fast and it's so easy, and it has so little impact on the rest of the development. Okay, that's it for now. I'm finished a bit early. Is there anything else that any questions, anything I can show you? Go on.
Could you go through how you would actually, so you've got your site there, how would you add a new page to it?
How would you add a new page to a site which is built conventionally? You would open a file, you'd create a script, and then you'd run it, right?
So you'd just be literally adding XML from
Yes, you'd literally be adding PHP, which creates the XML. But yes, it's exactly the same.
But what about functionality on that?
It's exactly the same. Whatever functionality you could provide from the PHP producing HTML, you can use the same PHP, modulate the protections, to produce XML. The functionality is identical. This is something you know how to do, honestly. Yeah.
Just wondering about content management systems.
Yeah.
And whether they use this sort of approach.
What are you thinking of in particular?
So we use content management system for managing templates, general kind of layout components and so on, as well as managing the content and allowing the business users to modify the content and so on. Behind the scenes, they use XSL to generate the pages, but it's kind of generated not like request generated at content or page creation. And I'm kind of wondering really whether the CMS providers take a sort of approach yet or not.
I'm not sure how to answer the question because it's such a big question. It involves so much specialist knowledge about so many products, but I will do my best to answer generally. As I understand it, most CMSs, particularly the ones which are going to give you source in things like PHP or C#, whatever their internal storage is, what they're trying to do is to produce HTML in one hit. Fundamentally, what they're doing is they're finding some way of capturing content, then they're storing the content, and then they're re-rendering the content for final use. Now, the capturing and the presentation involves a degree of behavior between the client and the server. I mean, you've got to fill in forms and send the forms, and then you've got to deliver it back in some kind of layout. Internally, it should be exactly the same. If your CMS is storing internally in XML, it's almost certainly because they're storing in something like Mongo. And that's a design choice. And that actually has nothing to do with what we're talking about here, because you could just as easily store in flat files, or you could just as easily store in relational databases, and the fundamental behavior wouldn't change. That's just their design choice. At the high levels, their application will be compartmentalized in some way, it'll be tiered in some way, so that it's got components which are speaking to the database layer, and there'll be components which are speaking up. If you have access to the source code, then the components which are speaking up, which are now producing HTML, should be modifiable to produce XML in a relatively simple way. But I think that you would be on your own recognizance when you do that. But the underneath layers, the fact that it's XML is incidental, but they would probably be preserved intact. Is that what you're asking me?
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah.
Okay.
And CMS recovery used to manage components, modify components, and so on. That's kind of a drag and drop type thing.
Right.
I'm thinking that that's probably not the approach.
Actually, I would disagree. The fact that you're doing drag and drop, it's giving you a particular type of interface. So my question to you would be, if you didn't have that drag and drop available, or if you had a different kind of drag and drop available, it's difficult to think of an example, but for example, if you wanted a text-only version of that same CMS, would that even make sense? If the answer to that question is yes, then it means that the drag and drop functionality is purely part of the skin and should be separated out in these terms. If it doesn't make sense, I mean, if what you have is a video game, is there a text-only version of a video game? And that ceases to make sense, then I'd say that's an inherent part of what it's doing, and it probably wouldn't be suitable for this reskilling in the same way. But no, the drag and drop, all of that functionality, the fact that you've got relationships going on, I mean, it's done by the HTML5 now, isn't it? You're not doing that the hard way. Who would these days? So it's absolutely a function of the skin. Any more?
I don't know whether it's a question, but just your views on kind of the methods that I'm using at the moment. I'm using master pages.
Yeah.
Basically, you've got your header, you've got your footer, you've got a content pane in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
We've created like a module called a script generator, which transforms XML using XSLT into that content pane.
Right.
We're not sending user agents in, so we're not driving the content in the way you've shown there today.
Yeah.
We're using like SAS to do that, and
Right.
CSS, but could you see there's no reason why I couldn't have passed the user agent into that content pane and then deliver content within that content pane based on what device the customer's using?
Absolutely
Do
not.
you see that as a
Totally
good
straightforward.
yeah.
I would say though that if I understand correctly what you're telling me, I think you're putting the cart before the horse. You see, one of the things that changes when you go from desktop onto mobile, on a desktop, and particularly modern desktops, you've got quite a lot of real estate. You can have nice big banners and nice big Chrome and lots of white space. When you're on a phone, even a big phone, you haven't got that. Every pixel counts. So the question is not to modify the content. You actually want to preserve the content. The question is to modify the layout and actually how you're using the real estate that you've got.
The layout's fairly simple, and because it's design fluid, it does adapt with the devices that we're delivering to. It may not be good for a wearable, but
Yeah.
that might be a problem. But for standard devices, it's fine. But
Yeah. One of the things that we found with the AOS site was that, in fact, we had an awful lot of content, which, you know, to a large extent, the people who are running this were brain dumping onto their website. It's part of the problem of having civilians as clients. But they were just sort of brain dumping onto the site. There's a hell of a lot of content. And when we mobilized it, we found that this was just completely overwhelming. And what we needed to do was to prioritize what we needed to say. And an important part of what this function is doing is saying, all right, well, this is the important points, and this, you know, give it to them if they've got enough space, if they care about it, if they ask for it, and, you know, this whole sort of second level content. When you switch from a desktop onto a mobile site, when you switch from a desktop onto a voice site, or any of those transformations, then this is a bit philosophical and a bit wishy-washy, and it's difficult to know how to approach this. But there is a sense in which you want to say, in which you want to recognise, I am still in the same website. I am still in Kansas. But there is also a sense in which you have a fundamental difference of the experience. When it's in your hand, when you've got a 3-foot interface, it is quite different from if you have a 10-foot interface, and it's quite different from if you're operating on a telly. And that too is a client which may become important in the future as smart TVs become important. Because a TV is not a desktop, but it's not a mobile either. You're asking me about drag and drop. Well, you know, drag and drop on the telly makes no sense whatever because you're on the other side of the room with remote control. So, but you still want a sense of Chrome, you still want a sense of immersion. And so the circle that we're trying to square here is how can you say this is still the same website and yet still say this is a correct use of this client device. Now, it may well be appropriate to modify the content, but you don't want to do too much damage to the content. You want to try and preserve the content as far as you can practically. You also want to preserve the branding, the image. The image you want seems to be very important. I mean, if you're on Argos on the telly or Argos on the phone or Argos on the desktop, it's still Argos, it's just a different shaped Argos. So there's a sense in which the branding is constant as well. So what is it that's changing? Well, it's something about the formatting, it's something about the ground plan. We don't actually have words for it right now. But the thing which is changing is the purpose of this exercise, this XSL transformation. So I've talked a lot around what you said, but is that helping you to answer the question? Okay, are you comfortable?
Yeah.
Okay. Any more? Okay, in that case, well, we've got 50 minutes to go. I will stay here. Other than that, have some coffee.